Well, it's official. Kyle Dubas has officially made his first trade as Penguins president of hockey operations, acquiring Reilly Smith from the Vegas Golden Knights in exchange for a third-round pick in next year's draft. I'll have my full thoughts and analysis coming up right after this.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to a special edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am your host, Hunter Hodes. Remember to follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. Follow the show's Twitter at LO Penguins. And of course, thank you all so much for making this your first listen / watch of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. I actually do have a special guest again for this special edition of the show. Nick Brlansky of Tip of the Iceberg helped break down the Reilly Smith acquisition. This is only going to be about an 8 to 10, maybe 15-minute video before I'll have a lot more on the trade later on for a full episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast, because the Penguins will obviously have the number 14 overall pick in just about 2 hours now when the draft officially kicks off. But Nick, Kyle Dubas makes his first trade, Reilly Smith to the Penguins for a third-round pick in next year's draft. That third rounder is the one they got back in the Teddy Blueger trade. So in essence, Nick, they sent out Teddy Blueger and they acquired Reilly Smith, something that I think everyone will sign up for. But I really like this move. Obviously, I think this means that Jason Zucker is not coming back for next season and beyond. 2 years at $5 million for Smith. Very similar production to Zucker, 26 goals, 56 points, Underlyings are really good, especially in transition and at 5-on-5 offense. When you saw this trade, what were your immediate reactions or thoughts,
My immediate thought was, okay, it's a little surprising here because I would have expected, the defense, the goaltender to be the first priority. But when something comes up. And apparently Reilly Smith came up on the trade market. And I think this was a really good deal by Kyle Dubas. And you talk about how it's the same pick. And it's funny that one general manager opened the door, the other one slammed it shut. And that's Kyle Dubas slamming it shut, getting Reilly Smith for a third-round pick. But when I first saw it, I thought, okay, there's the Penguins' top six, but also somebody that basically, like you mentioned, closes the door on Jason Zucker, somebody that I would have liked to see the Penguins re-sign. But I think at the end of the day, when you look at everything encompassing with this trade, it's going to end up being a better move for the Pittsburgh Penguins in the long run.
I agree. And the way I saw it with this acquisition, the Penguins had a choice here. And you can see that front office actually has a plan with this move. They could have been like, okay, we're going to commit a lot of term and money to Zucker, or we could go shorter term, similar money for someone who puts up very similar production. And that's what they're doing in acquiring Reilly Smith and sending Zucker out the door. That was my first immediate reaction to the trade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what with the Zucker situation, I think you also have to look at it with the fact that, Jason Zucker was great last season, but he was also volatile. Like, I do think that he could have replicated what he did this past season, but at the same time, the way that he plays and the speed at which he plays and the way that he basically throws his body around like he's invincible, even though he's shown that he is not, there was a question about whether or not on a 5-year deal you would have even gotten 3 healthy years out of him. Now, again, I don't want to bash Jason Zucker because I do think that he was great in the locker room for that team. I think he was great on the ice for that team, specifically this past season. But Reilly Smith is a more trustworthy person to put on that side, knowing that the best ability, as you know, Hunter, is always availability. I mean, it's the most overused term in sports. And Reilly Smith definitely gives that to the Penguins in spades.
Yeah, he hasn't even missed 5 games over the past couple of seasons. So he is very healthy. I understand Zucker was healthy for the team this year, but as you said, Nick, do you really think that was going to be the case on a 4 to 5, maybe 6-year term for $5.5 million? And also, this was a career year for him. Do we really know if he was going to put up 27 goals for the next 3 to 4 seasons? So I get it from that perspective. And Smith, this basically rounds out your top 6. They'll have some combination. Jake Gensel, Sidney Crosby, Brian Russ / Rickard Rakell, Reilly Smith, Evgeny Malkin, the other Rust or Rakell on the second line. Mm-hmm. And I think your top 6 is close to, if not just as potent, even though Zucker is not there. Don't get me wrong. I think Zucker is the better player. If he would have wanted 2 times 5, I would have said, okay, I'll give that to him. We don't have to trade for Smith. But he wanted more term. Dubas is probably like, nope, I don't want to do that considering your injury history and your age. So we're going to go out and get someone who, yes, he's a bit older, but someone who can produce just as much, and there's not as much risk to it. Heck, again, they gave up a 3rd round pick. That's magic beans here.
Yeah, and I also think the other thing that you have to look at, I know this isn't, Zucker for Reilly Smith trade, but it almost feels like it for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But even though Reilly Smith, I agree with you, might not be as good as Jason Zucker at peak level, I think he does bring a different dimension to the Penguins' top 6. He's great on the rush, which is something that the Pittsburgh Penguins just didn't have and really haven't had since Phil Kessel. I'd have to go back and look at some of those other teams between now and 2018, but they don't have somebody that's going to come down on the wing and just score the easy goals. I mean, Jake Gensel can from time to time, but he didn't really do that last season. Adding Reilly Smith is something that is going to add a new dimension to the Penguins' top 6. It might not top out as high as it would if Jason Zucker came back and played at his peak, but I think it gives a new dimension to the Pittsburgh Penguins and ultimately makes them harder to play against.
I agree with that for sure. He is elite in transition. If you look at all the different charts out there, Andy and Rono do good work. JFresh Hockey, he is very good in transition. Actually ranks in the 89th percentile among all players. If you look at Andy and Rono, offensively 84th percentile. You're not going to get a lot of defensive impacts from him, but you also didn't get a lot of defensive impacts from Jason Zucker. So this is fine. I really like this move. I didn't expect it to be the first one that he makes because I thought he would have maybe gone after a top 4 defenseman, a goaltender. But in terms of replacing someone who you probably knew you were going to lose no matter what, you can do a lot worse than Reilly Smith, especially when you look at the free agent class. Heck, as we're recording this, Nick, Vegas just signed Ivan Barbashev to 5 times 5. These players are starting to come off the market. Tyler Bertuzzi is potentially going to get signed by Boston. The Penguins have the cap space for that, but they're not going to make that move because he's the best free agent available. But this is, I think, is better than going out into the free agent market and overpaying someone for the next 4 to 5 years to not give you as good of production.
Yeah, and when I believe it was Elliot Friedman of 32 Thoughts said there are players out there for free, and boy, was it as free as you could potentially even get it with Reilly Smith. You sent back a 3rd round pick that you acquired from Vegas literally 2 months ago. So paying whatever the opposite of a premium is in Kyle Dubas. Now, that's not to say that it's going to all work out and be great and it's going to be a fantastic fit, but Reilly Smith has succeeded in a lot of the places that he's gone. Specifically, he did in Vegas, but he was pretty good in Florida too. They overpaid him and they had too many cooks in the kitchen, and then they got rid of him at the expansion draft. And then you see what's happened since he went to Vegas. He took advantage of the opportunity.
Yes, and another thing I do want to add just before we wrap up here, Nick, I've been seeing this thrown out on Reddit, social media, all these other places where Penguins fans come together. I understand that he is a bit older, but there's no law in which you can say, oh, no players over 30. This player had almost 60 points this past season. You obviously don't want to go out and acquire someone like Kyle Granlund, and I hate bringing that up just because he's still on the team. He just wasn't a good fit. But Reilly Smith can play even though he is 32 years old. They can get younger in other areas, and I expect them to. But the age thing, it's only 2 more years. He just had a great season, regular season and playoffs. I am fine with it despite him being on the older side.
Yeah, he's 32, but he's not Jeff Carter. Like that, let's stop drawing that comparison. And the same with Mikael Granlund. Mikael Granlund's issue is not his age. It's his talent at this point of his career, which is the unfortunate issue. But like you mentioned, Reilly Smith, not only 26 goals this season, 14 points in 22 games going to the Stanley Cup. And guess what? He wasn't on the top line. That was Barbashev, who just got signed for 5x5, like you mentioned. There's a reason that they made the deal. It wasn't because they didn't want Reilly Smith. It's because he's an unfortunate cap casualty that just tends to happen every single year for the Vegas Golden Knights.
Yes, and I will give you and Horwat credit. You guys predicted this on your show this week. I got to say, I was looking at a few cap crunch teams. Vegas did not come to mind for some reason, and I apologize to all the listeners / watchers out there. This is why tip of the iceberg is also one of the best Penguins podcasts out there because they called this one from the start.
I appreciate the props. I will say it was not the only one, so I'm not going to sit here and say, you know what, I sat down and said, hey, this is the move that happens. It's not what I said. It's not what happened, but I did mention, obviously, Reilly Smith in Vegas. It just seems like every year, they want to sign Barbashev. They want to sign Hill, and I'm like, they never have cap space, so they can't have it now. So, yes, I looked at Vegas, and another team that I'm looking at now is Calgary, so we'll see if the Penguins can swing another deal with Kyle Dubas, but Calgary has a lot of defensemen for sale. That's all I'll say.
Well, Noah Hannafin is one of them, and I would sure love to pair him with Chris Letang. That's for sure. Real quick here, Nick, before we wrap up, what do you expect Dubas to do next now that Reilly Smith is in the fold?
Trade down. That 14th overall pick, I'd love to see him do it, but he's trading back in the draft. It's really just a gut feeling. He's done it twice in 5 years with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he just seems primed to do it once again here in this draft.
Well, we will see if that prediction also comes true from Brlansky. Tonight, NHL draft set to start at 7 o'clock. Penguins have the number 14 overall pick. Either way, my friends, I think they're going to walk away with a very, very good prospect, even if they stay at 14 or if they trade down. But that does it for this special edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'll have a full episode out later tonight, getting into who they picked, more details on the Reilly Smith acquisition and what could be next. So stick around for that coming up later tonight.